Hey YouTube, what's going on? Today we got something really, really cool. I've wanted this for 30 years. I have worked so hard to try and acquire one of these. And as I've become more involved in other props and things like that, it's always been in the back of my mind, I hope I could trade for one of these, or I hope I can find a way to get my hands on one of these. I have finally acquired it. I'm excited to show it to you. If you read the title, you already know what this is. This is an actual casting from a mold of a screen-used handle. And I gotta tell you, it's awesome. Let's cue the intro, and let's take a look.
Behold, my stuff.
Okay, so, the Highlander.
There can be only one.
Epic movie. Does it make the most sense? No, it's an 80s movie. None of the movies make sense. But I've loved the Highlander my whole life. I love Duncan MacLeod. I love Connor MacLeod. I saw the cartoon with Quentin MacLeod. I saw the anime. Loved everything the Highlander put out, man. Used to get the Watcher catalog to my house. I'd look through all the crap that I would never afford and that my parents wouldn't buy for me, etc., etc., etc. I own all 6 seasons of the Highlander show. My dad was very much into samurai culture and Japanese culture, martial arts. He was a big martial artist himself. He did goju-ryu and things like that. He studied some kendo, and he had a set of samurai swords in his house that were displayed in my parents' bedroom. I still don't know how he got away with that. But for most of my entire childhood, those things were on display on their dresser in the room. And that was always really cool to me. After he passed away, I took those swords, and it was a wakizashi and a katana set. And it was a tanged sword. It wasn't a rat tail. It was a full tang sword. Well, maybe a half tang. But it was a display sword. It wasn't meant to be anything more than that. And I carried them with me over 10 years, moving house to house. Eventually, I cannibalized the wakizashi to make something else for myself. And I still had the katana. And I always said to myself, I am not going to throw this out. This was my dad's. But I'd love to make it a Connor MacLeod sword one day. Well, after many, many years of trading and building my name up in the prop community and trying to have value, I did manage to get a hold of a casting of an H1, that's what we call him, Connor MacLeod. It's a solid resin cast. It's extremely thin from what most of you guys have seen, and it's smaller than most people think it is, because if you know the history of these blades, which I do, it's an interesting one. This is not a Mentor. This is not a Janai. This is not a Tom Malak remake. This is the real deal. And we know exactly which one it's been cast from. So I can tell you that this particular piece, I was so happy to have it. I was going to order some cloth that had the MacLeod pattern on it. Just make a display for it. And that was going to be the end of it. But I thought to myself, I could cast this for myself. I could make a sword, but it needs to have tang access, so I can't use this. But if I use this as a positive, I can make a mold and I can make one. Now, unfortunately, this was such a complicated piece. I didn't want to do a 2-piece mold. I didn't want seam lines and all that crap. I had to bring in a friend of mine to help me out who knew what the hell he was doing, and I've worked with him a few different times on some different projects, and I got to tell you, the mold he sent me so that I can make my own worked beautifully, and the result that I got is perfect. Is it screen accurate? That's the first question everybody hits me with. Is it screen accurate? No. This much of it is. Once you get to the Tsuba, not screen accurate. Why? Because I used a United Cutlery Tsuba. Al, if you were going to make a screen-accurate version, why did you use a United Cutlery Tsuba? 2 reasons. One, the one they used in the film is a piece of shit. And if you look at it closely, it's like, oh, look at all that fancy detailing. It's not fancy detailing. They took a drill bit, a drill press, and just drilled out a bunch of shapes. And that was the friggin' Tsuba. And it was just a brass thing. Actually, I think it might have even been just a plated aluminum. I don't even know. But the worn-out ones, you can see the metal underneath. It's silver. It wasn't pretty. I actually have a metal one. We used a scan of this to make the thicker, bigger, katana-sized one for con-safe swords that I'm going to be making. I want to make one of these that's con-safe that I can bring with me. But this guy wasn't going to cut it. I needed a big, thick one. And the United Cutlery one is the right kind of size, but it's just a little more ornate. It's a little prettier. I want it to be pretty. And I'm going to use a pretty blade. So it's coated aluminum blade. Catches light beautifully, which I love. And again, this is a display blade. The hockey here is not a perfect fit. You can see it's just a little bit bigger than the blade is. This rattles a little bit. I got to glue it into place, which again, I'm fine with. But again, it's a display blade. It's designed to do one thing and one thing only, display. So first things first, the reason you know it is screen used is because look at how much detail is not lost in the casting. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a minute. Look at the kimonos. Look at the detail in the hair. Now, all that crisp, beautiful detail, once you get to the dragon, you might be like, well, Al, wait a minute. The dragon head looks like shit. You're right, it does. You know why? Because the handle wasn't made by the company that did the props, the prop master. The prop master did sculpt this out of Bondo, I think. But it looks like butt because it's a crap sculpt. It's asymmetrical. It's very wonky. And you'll notice that there's a bit of a taper with this handle, which is not part of the original sword. We still to this day don't even know what really happened with it. Was it mineral spirits? Was it just the brands of materials they used that caused the shrinkage? Was the mold distorted by how they bound it? We don't know. We have seen the mold for the H2. There was recently a video where a gentleman on Your Props or something like that made a lightsaber out of the H2. And I believe Mike De La Vega lent the actual screen-used mold for that. It's a box mold. It's a 2-part mold with a jacket. And so the H2 is really a casting of this sanded down and then redetailed. So even the detail on the H2 is very gone. It's my favorite version, though. I do love that look. That had the yellowing and the black on it. It was really cool. Crap movie, but great sword. And then the Tsuba is kind of shitty. It's not a good Tsuba. It's more of a distorted version of the H1. And then the H3 was a completely new sculpt. It was inspired by this, but the details look like this, but it's a totally new sculpt to honor this. And the Tsuba is just a completely new one that was made for the film. It was based off of a sketch of the H2, which was distorted even more, and it's just wonky as shit. But I really, really, really love the H1. Now, if you go online and if you search Ramirez screen-used katana, you'll see that they auctioned off, I believe it's on Your Props, a screen-used Ramirez. I have tried to recreate that paint job to the best of my ability. You'll see little red specks here and there. There is a parchment finish over this entire casting, and then I did a white dry brushing on top of that to catch some highlights and create some depth. But it's got some red in there, some clay-like look, and I had to recreate that, because if you compare it to this particular version, which is my positive, you may not see much of a difference, but I do. And so I was very, very specific. This is meant to replicate what I saw on that auction as best I could, because that to me is a screen accurate. Now, it's funny because you could pick a lot of different H1s to make. You may notice in the final scene when Connor receives the quickening and he drops the sword, the head snaps off. So he actually broke one. One thing I will say is also there's the mystery of the floating pin. There are several scenes where you'll see a gold brass pin floating around in the katana. It comes and goes. A lot of us go back and forth about whether or not we include the pin or not. I chose not to include it. But overall, I'm really, really thrilled. So thrilled with this piece. And I am going to glue it a little bit more into place than it is. So it's got a little bit of wiggle here, a little bit of here. I'll be honest with you. I dipped into the mold and just cast it that way. This is not removable. So I've never done that before, but I couldn't figure out another way I wanted to do it. But overall, I'd say that I did a pretty good job doing a dip and wish, if you will. I have some ideas about how to prevent doing that in the future and making this removable, but super thrilled with the H1. I finally have it after years and years and years of searching, which makes me happy because it now partners with the very first one of these that I got when I was 16. My dad bought me a Mardo Sword of the Dragon, and this is the exact make and model that they use in Highlander Endgame and Highlander Season 6 of the show. And it's a real sword. It's a full tang sword. It's balanced for the most part. It's got that beautiful Mardo symbol on the habaki. I believe that's how you say it. But what really gives it away is that it's got a brass collar here, and it's got a brass collar here wrapped around the natural collar of the Sword of the Dragon. It's much bigger than what we encounter from the H1. So you might be asking, well, how do you get from that to this? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to give you a little crash course in Highlander swords. The handle, which is the most common handle you see on katanas that are not just straight up wrapped, is called the Ivory Mardo. And that sword was released back in the middle of the 1900s. And that handle looks like this. And this was the first thing I was able to get my hands on, because my original intention was if I could get my hands on a casting of an Ivory Mardo, I could just make my own, and I'll sculpt my own. And I did, and it didn't work out so great. But I thought that was at least step one. So this is the actual Ivory Mardo. And again, if I go in here and we look at this again, you can see there's just a lot of detail in the Ivory Mardo that isn't in later versions of this. And the main thing that I point out with this is that the reason it has that is because every generational cast, you lose a little bit of it. So this is cast right off of an Ivory Mardo. So this was how I started. I was like, okay, I got this. I can make a sword out of this. I just got to sculpt the head on it. And what I originally thought to myself was, the Connor's going to be too difficult. Damn it. But I was a big fan of the Highlander show, and I thought, well, maybe I could get a Season 1 Highlander. So what I'll do is I'll cast up my dragon head, and I'll put that on the end of it, and I'll make a Season 1 Highlander sword from Duncan. This was my attempt to sort of rework a Sword of the Dragon head into something a little bit more Musashi-like. Didn't really happen. So what I ended up doing was I got a hold of a Musashi. Now, what is a Musashi? A Musashi is a Sal Tequila, did a version of the S1, but it wasn't accurate. So Sal got a hold of a proper casting. Let me do it on this side. Got a hold of a casting of the handle, which you need. I don't know if it was a direct casting of an Ivory Mardo or if it was a later version, but it's missing a lot of the detail. And then sculpted on the head for the S1. And it's very close to the S1. It's extremely good looking, and it's very smooth, it's very detailed, it's a beautiful sculpture. And what most people will do is, because these were very accessible, they'll get a hold of the Musashi, cast just the head, and then sculpt it onto a Sword of the Dragon era of this era, the Mardos, which are very easy to get, the reissued Sword of the Dragon from Season 5 and 6 and the movie Endgame. And then you get what we call the Fat Musashi, because this handle is a lot thinner than the Sword of the Dragon. So you end up with a Fat Musashi, is what we call that. But again, I thought, I got a problem with that, because again, I really wasn't confident in my ability to resculpt this. I could cast it, but then reattaching it, I would really have preferred to get a hold of a piece. But here's the problem with the Musashi. Notice the details here in the panel, right? Let's go to this side. Okay, and then we drop down to the tiger. Notice the bottom panel doesn't match. Why? Look closely. There's a cut line. Sal cut this off and flipped the panel so that it wouldn't be accurate. There's debate about why, but a lot of people will tell you they know for a fact why, or Sal told them why. It was a copyright thing. It was to make it an original. It was inspired by. Look, the bottom line is, it was cut, it was not accurate, so if you got a Musashi, it's not accurate to the S1. Found someone who got me an S1. A convertible S1. This was not easy to come by. So you'll notice that this tapers up a little bit, whereas this is still pretty flat, but there's a taper. So I always wanted the S1. I love that. That's the one he dueled Connor with. I was really happy about that. So how do you get from that to this? Well, I'll answer your question. Instead of having the production crew make these, eventually Davis Panzer decided to just partner up with Mardo and let them handle all the swords. Since they made the original Mardo Ivory, which was the base for all of these swords, what they did was they just said, well, hell, we'll just make all the new swords. So they did. So they made the Sword of the Dragon. And then as Adrian would use them over the seasons, they would modify them, and, he would break bits and things like that. So they would come up with different collaring systems and things like that so they could change them out, put a stunt blade in, take a stunt blade out. So they found out that the detachable head was very useful. There's all this cool stuff that you can find on the various Highlander sites and stuff like that. And we eventually ended up with this version of the Mardo that we know. And they made another version of this for Endgame. They released an officially licensed Connor in a black scabbard. It was in the Watcher's catalog. And that particular sword was most known for being oversized. And it had, in the scales, black, like, V's inside the scaling. So you see how these look like basically took a pencil and just kind of pushed it in? So all those scales were hand sculpted with little black V's for highlights, and then a split, like an arrowhead, down the middle of each of those scales. So what a lot of people will do is they'll get a hold of one of those, bleach the thing out, get all the ink out of it, and then you got a pretty convincing H1, because it does come with a proper Tsuba. The Tsuka looks pretty good, but it's oversized, but it's the exact one you see in Endgame. The one that Connor uses in Endgame is not an H1, it's that Mardo remake. No detail changes at all. It's just straight up that sword. So if you want a screen accurate Connor, technically you can get the one from Endgame if you can find that sword. So again, Mardo made all these swords. And so there was never an attempt to revisit the original sword. As much as that new one is crisp and clean and beautiful, there is something so cool about owning this ugly, chunky piece of crap sculpt. Just know, it just reeks of 80s. We're like, hell, there's no such thing as HD or any of that. It just has to look good enough. When I was a kid, this looked like the greatest sculpture in the world. It is the Ramirez, and you can't help but do the voices when you hold this. Sometimes, MacLeod, the sharpest blade isn't enough. You just want to sing. B-A-L-A-N-C, balance. I don't like boats and I don't like water. I'm a man, not a fish. And you just want to just do the lines, man. There can be only one.
There can be only one.
It's just gorgeous. It's just so much fun to have. And like I said, it's been a childhood dream. The fact that I was able to convert my father's sword into this sword is a way for me to still keep something of my dad's, something that we both, and make it something we both loved. And it just has more deeper meaning to me. I'm happy the franchise is alive. They have new action figures. Connor MacLeod got an action figure, and he's holding the book, the metallurgy book. And then there's the little H1. You can see the sword. Got some of that detail in there. It looks like they 3D scanned one of these and just shrunk it down and printed it, and that's how they made it. And I've been looking for one of these for 30 years, and now that I have a mold, I can do what I always wanted to do, which was make a con-safe one of these. And maybe actually cosplay as Connor MacLeod, which I'm very happy with. Or maybe I'll get really ambitious and do a Ramirez. That would be really sick. If I could do that, I'd be so happy. You guys know I love my prop swords, but I will say I own a real kurgan. Because kurgan is the shit, and his sword was the shit. I love me some Highlander. I hope you've enjoyed this little brief history of the Highlander swords. Like I said, this is not a Janai. This is not a Mentor. This is not a Tomalak. This is a really real screen lineage casting. And I'm gonna really enjoy having this in my collection. It is definitely some epic stuff. And I've always said, if you can't buy it, build it. And if you can't build it, buy it. Well, today I'm gonna tell you, sometimes you need to buy it and build it. Stay tuned for all my future shit coming up. I got a bunch of shit coming up. You guys saw my Evil Dead stuff, so I hope you go check that video out. I do have a painting tutorial up right now. To all the people who helped me acquire this, you know who you are. I won't name you, but thank you. And hopefully I could do a video one day really breaking down the history of the hilt, where it came from, who did what, or like a video montage video where I narrate over it and really explain that. If you want to see that, let me know in a comment below and I will gladly start working on that video. Thanks for checking it out. Stay tuned for more stuff coming down the pipe. There's some really cool shit coming down for Halloween. Can't wait to show you guys. So if you can't build it, buy it. If you can't buy it, build it. And if you really get stuck, do both.